Africa's economies are standing at a major crossroads. On one hand, they're on the front line of what some are calling a global polycrisis. But on the other, there's an incredible, ambitious plan in motion, a plan worth $3.4 trillion that aims to forge a much stronger, more resilient future from within. You know, this statement from the UN's Rebecca Grinspan just nails it. The world is facing this polycrisis. That's where you have multiple huge shocks like the pandemic, climate change, and geopolitical conflict, all hitting at the same time. And the reality is, Africa is feeling that impact more than pretty much anywhere else. So here's our game plan for today. First, we're going to look at why the continent is so exposed in the first place. Then, we'll dive into what experts call the tangled web of vulnerability. But from there, and this is the exciting part, we're going to turn to the solution, a massive, game-changing trade deal, the new financial tools being built to make it happen, and what it all means for a more independent future. All right, let's dive in. Now, look, issues like high debt or depending on foreign markets, these aren't exactly new for Africa. But the really crucial thing to understand right now is that all these recent global crises have acted like a massive stress test, hitting all of these pressure points at the exact same time. It's magnified all those old challenges and created a level of economic vulnerability that is just unprecedented. So that begs the question, right? What is it that makes Africa so exposed to these shocks? Well, UN experts have a great way of describing it. They call it a web of vulnerability. Basically, a whole series of interconnected weaknesses that don't just add up, they actually amplify one another, creating a really dangerous cycle. And the key here is that none of these vulnerabilities exist in a vacuum. It's not like you can just solve one and be done. Political instability absolutely wrecks the economy, which then gets made even worse by the technological divide. Climate disasters create massive social pressures. You see how it works? Each problem feeds the others, creating that dangerous cycle of risk we just mentioned. I mean, just take the political side of things. Since 1950, there have been 220 coup attempts in Africa. That's nearly half of the entire world's total. That kind of instability creates this massive cloud of uncertainty, and it just scares away the long-term investment that's absolutely essential for any kind of real economic growth. And then you've got the crushing economic pressure of debt. By 2023, nearly half of the continent's nations had debt loads that were bigger than 60% of their entire economy. Think about what that really means. It often forces governments to spend more money just paying interest than they do on things like healthcare or education for their own people. And then there's infrastructure. Gaps in roads, ports, energy, and digital networks, they drive up the cost of absolutely everything. These gaps make trade within Africa a staggering 50% more expensive than the global average. That makes it incredibly difficult for African products to compete even before they leave the continent. So, when you see all these challenges stacked up like this, it raises the most important question of all, doesn't it? How on earth does the continent break free from this web? How can it move from being so vulnerable to these shocks to being resilient against them? Well, the answer, and this is where the story gets really hopeful, lies in one of the most ambitious economic projects on the entire planet. It's a plan to fundamentally rewire trade across the continent, to shift the focus away from the rest of the world and back towards its neighbors. And here it is, the headline number. The African Continental Free Trade Area, or the AfCFTA, represents a combined market with the potential of $3.4 trillion. We're not talking about a small improvement here. This is a monumental opportunity to build a powerful new economic engine from within the continent itself. Now, the key thing to get about the AfCFTA is that it's so much more than just a deal to lower tariffs. It's really a blueprint for a total economic transformation. The goal is to stop relying so heavily on volatile global markets and start building stronger, more resilient supply chains right there in Africa. And to see just how big the potential is, just look at these numbers. Right now, only 16% of Africa's trade is with other African countries. The other 84% is with the rest of the world. Just imagine the new jobs, the new industries, the new wealth that could be created by shifting even a fraction of that trade back into the continent. But okay, a free trade agreement is just a piece of paper without the right tools to make it actually work. For this vision to become a reality, the continent needs new financial plumbing, new ways for money and goods to flow smoothly across dozens of different borders. And one of the biggest roadblocks right now is financing. There's a persistent continent-wide trade finance gap of about $100 billion every single year. And this gap hits the small and medium-sized businesses, the real engines of employment, the hardest, basically locking them out of regional trade. A huge part of the problem is this systemic bias in funding. As you can see, right now, a whopping 82% of trade financing from African banks goes to businesses that are trading with other continents. Only a tiny 18% supports trade within Africa. The money just isn't flowing where this new growth needs to happen. So to solve these kinds of problems, African-led institutions are building brand new financial infrastructure. A perfect example is something called the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, or PEPS. You see, the old way meant that if two African businesses wanted to trade, they had to settle up in dollars or euros and route the money through a bank in New York or London. It was expensive, slow, and risky. But the new way with PAPS lets them trade and settle instantly, directly, in their own local currencies. It's basically a financial superhighway for the continent. And this is all happening at such a critical moment. The world itself is deglobalizing. If you look at these two maps of trade flows, the one on the left from about a decade ago is much more spread out, right? Global. But the one on the right from today is different. Trade is clumping together into regional blocks. So as the world breaks into these trading groups, the need for Africa to form its own has never, ever been more urgent. So, what does this all mean for the future? Well, it's really about putting all these pieces together. You've got the trade agreement, the financial tools, and the political will to turn this incredible potential into an everyday reality. And this isn't just a vague hope. Experts have laid out a really clear playbook for governments to follow right now. Look at your budgets through a vulnerability lens to prepare for shocks. Use policy to stabilize your financial systems. Get emergency funding out to traders. And use things like tax incentives to boost local manufacturing. Ultimately, when you boil it all down, the goal of this entire transformation is to shift Africa's position in the global economy. It's about moving from being a passive rule taker, always subject to the ups and downs of external markets and global politics, to becoming an active rule shaper. One that can assert its own financial autonomy, invest in its own people and capacity, and speak with one powerful voice to define a more resilient and inclusive future. The question is no longer about potential, but about execution.